Welcome to 132 Problems Revisiting Mormon Polygamy, where we explore the scriptural, theological, and historical case for plural marriage. And actually, all of those will come up in this conversation. I am very happy to be able to bring you this conversation that I had with Benjamin Shaffer, who is Apostle 70 or a 70 apostle in Christ Church, which is a fundamentalist sect of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It was such a privilege to be able to talk to him. I'm so glad that he agreed to come on and have this conversation. I hope that you will all get a lot out of it, because I believe I did. I'll give you a little bit of background. A couple of weekends ago, I had the privilege of going to Don and Jasmine Bradley's lovely wedding reception. And there I met some very interesting people that I hadn't necessarily anticipated meeting. And one of them was Benjamin Shaffer, who came up and spoke to me, and which I appreciated. We had a very interesting exchange. And I reached out to him a little while later and asked if he would be willing to come on the podcast. And I was just delighted that he agreed. I really wanted to be able to, I really do want to be able to engage with people on every side of this issue, including and maybe even especially people who are living plural marriage and who believe in those doctrines that I believe that Brigham taught, especially in Utah. So I hope that this conversation will be interesting to you. I really appreciated that Benjamin was willing to come and that we had what felt to me, and I hope felt to him, like an even exchange, and it wasn't any kind of, there was no combativeness or contention, just sharing ideas and pushing back a bit on each other. And I really appreciated that. I hope that that same example can be followed in the comments of not attacking people, but just discussing the ideas. I really am anxious to hear people's thoughts on this conversation, because I thought it was valuable, and I hope that it will lead to many more. So thank you so much for joining us as we take this deep dive into the murky waters of current fundamentalist Mormonism. Welcome to 132 Problems. This is an episode that kind of fell into my lap that I'm actually really excited for. So I am here with Benjamin Shaffer, who is, Benjamin, you'll have to help me with your introduction in just a minute, but I believe an apostle in Christ Church, which is a fundamentalist sect of Mormonism. Did I explain that all right? Is that accurate?
Yeah, you explained that all right. I'm a 70 apostle. We do use the apostle for both the 12 and the 70. But because we're all supposed to go out there and be witnesses of Christ, right? But yeah, I'm not in the 12 or anything like that.
Okay. I gave him a little too high of status. Thank you for your humility. Okay. And actually, so Benjamin and I was at a wedding last week, and Benjamin came up and introduced himself, and I hadn't realized that when I walked into this wedding, there were many fundamentalists, and it was interesting and a little unsettling because I hadn't expected that. And I used to, it's actually been kind of sad for me, because I used to have more friends that were fundamentalists before I became enemy number one, which I understand, but it is sad to me. But Benjamin came up and introduced himself and asked if he could take a selfie. And I was feeling a little like I've been kind of under attack lately. So I was a little standoffish, I'm afraid. But just because I didn't know what to expect and I wasn't quite prepared for it.
And I was like, oh my gosh, I've got to get my brother and my friends. I got to tell them, hey, guess what? I met Michelle Stone.
Yeah, right. And so, he did come up and ask me some interesting questions. And we were able to have a bit of a conversation, not much, because there were a lot of people around. But so I reached out to Benjamin and I was like, hey, I'll do you better than a selfie. How about we have an actual conversation on the podcast? Because while we are theologically very different, and I totally understand that, and I understand that I am hitting at things that are incredibly sacred to you and people who think like you. So I understand it. But at the same time, I really do believe that we don't have to have divisions, that we can still have charity and understanding and love for one another. Because I really believe, my feeling is, when the Lord says, if you're not one, you're not mine, it doesn't mean we all have to agree, because that's impossible. It just means that we see each other as children of God who are learning things in a different order than we are, maybe. hopefully all well intended. Anyway,
Yeah.
that's what I was hoping to do. And I think Benjamin asked me some questions that I thought were genuine, but that I was surprised he had to ask. He didn't know very much about me, and I didn't know very much about him. So I thought it'd be good if we could kind of let people see us, kind of get to know each other, share our journeys, and then maybe engage in some questions that people might want to have with one another. So does that sound all right, Benjamin? Is that okay?
That sounds great. And I hope you don't mind if I ask you a couple of questions too, because there's...
No, I was hoping you would.
I haven't seen every single episode of 132 Problems, but I've seen some of it, of course. And I had a lot of questions about why, what's the rationale behind some things. Besides, I mean, of course, you give a lot of explanation, but it raised additional questions for me. And so that's good. And, when I do my missionary work, it isn't about baptizing or converting everyone in the world. A whole lot of this dialogue is really about just seeing each other as people. Mormon fundamentalists, Mormons in general, but Mormon fundamentalists in particular, have a long history of persecution. We're very shy people usually, very, very nervous about having any public exposure because we're afraid everyone's going to grab their torches and pitchforks and come and try to burn our house down or tear our families apart or throw someone in jail or something like that. Now, plural marriage is not actually illegal anymore. But it's not a criminal act anymore. But we still get very nervous that people are going to be very upset at us and things like that. And so, yeah,
which I understand because I take an immense amount of hate in the space I'm in,
right.
From every quarter. So I understand.
Oh, I thought this is fun. You said that you described yourself as like public enemy number one for polygamy. And I thought it was funny because you guys have the enemy of my enemy is my friend sometimes. And I thought it was interesting that before your show, really, I would say it was Brian Hales that was viewed as public enemy number one, generally, because Brian Hales is this apologist for the church. And he's always trying to be like, oh, well, we shouldn't have polygamy. And here's why we shouldn't have polygamy. And here's why all the fundamentalists are wrong. And here's why all the history is my way. And that justifies the church. And we always... basically, okay, I had a lot of good civil dialogue with Brian Hales over the years, okay? I've written a lot of long strings of emails with him. He's not a bad person, but yeah, I kind of viewed him as the major spokesperson in anti-polygamy before your show. And it's funny that from your perspective, you're like, oh, Brian Hales and the Joseph Smith polygamy volumes and that history and all that's public enemy number one to you guys. And I was like, oh, wow. Are we like the opposite ends of the political spectrum with a common opponent? I thought that was rather interesting.
It's fascinating because I've actually come to view it a little bit differently because I see Brian Hales interacting in spaces where there are fundamentalists. And now that I guess I am on the scene and people who agree with me are on the scene, it is actually seems to me to kind of have united Brian Hales and the fundamentalists because now,
like I said, we were the total opposite ends before, but now it's a little bit like, oh, at least he admits that there was such a thing. That's polygamy.
Yeah, he's giving us. Yeah, like the fundamentalists I've seen love Brian Hales now because I've become. Yeah, and then that's what's so interesting to me is that, like on one side, I was thinking about this in a debate, for example. On one side, there would be me, and I would have like a member of the restoration branches that broke off of the Community of Christ on one side, and maybe like someone who has left the church to pursue the Book of Mormon, like someone that has left in the direction of Denver Snuffer or something like that. Like I'm an active member of the church, and that would be my team. But then on the other side, there would be a fundamentalist, a traditional member of the LDS church, right? And like the most Joseph Smith hating anti-Mormon all on the same side as we discuss the question of Joseph Smith's polygamy, because all of those groups use exactly the same sources. You know what? Not, in my opinion, not because they're the only or even the best sources. They're just the ones that tell that side of the story that makes the most sense to that group. So polygamy makes strange bedfellows.
It does. It does. So now I'm all like, go Brian Hales sometimes.
Yeah, I know.
Never in his camp before the whole polygamy denial thing came out. So.
Okay, I'm glad you brought that up because I was going to ask you about that. That's interesting. I'm glad to know that you guys are cheering Brian Hales on. See, that's what I've been saying, people.
It's strange bedfellows.
Yes. So Benjamin, would you mind giving us just a brief rundown of kind of your history, your journey? Did you start out LDS? Were you like let us know kind of where you've come from, and then the second question, I'll just give you a whole big thing, and you can just wax eloquent about it if you want to.
Okay, I'll try to keep it like 10 minutes then.
That would be great. Yeah. And then I would like you to kind of explain where your church, Christ Church, fits into the broader fundamentalist movement, because I know more the FLDS, the AUB, the Kingstons, I kind of know those bigger categories. And so the Centennial Park broke off of the FLDS. I have the basic outline, but
That's
Christ
good.
Church, it seems to be more and more breakoffs that I'm not up on. So if you wouldn't mind giving us those two rundowns, that would be really helpful.
Okay, super. Okay, so first of all, I was raised mainstream LDS. I was raised by a temple attending, tithing paying, fully active parents. Went to primary all the way through, served a mission, got married in the temple, checked all the boxes. I was very, very passionate about the gospel ever since the Know Your Religion series they used to do, where they'd get somebody from BYU or something like that to go out to different stakes and give talks. And even just as a young man, I was very, very passionate about the gospel. And that made our family a little different, but I didn't realize that yet. Because when kids are out there playing cowboys and Indians, we were playing like Nephites and Lamanites, and we were playing looking for our seer stones instead of just seashells. You know what I mean? We were like, we're all going to be prophets someday. We're going to, my parents actually would talk to us about the seer stones in family meeting. They talked to us about about the manifestations of the Kirkland Temple. They talked to us about polygamy. I remember my parents and my mother and father bearing their testimonies to me about the divine principle of celestial plural marriage when I was a kid in family evening. And I thought this was the same experience that all mainstream Mormons were having.
Okay.
And so when I encountered people who didn't even know that Mary was one of the wives of God, I was like, dude, did you pay attention in primary or what? Do you know what I mean? On my mission, so I was one of those. I recognize that was weird now, but at the time that was normal enough to me. But it also made me very passionate about studying history, studying doctrine, studying the fullness of the gospel, studying everything I could about Mormonism. I even read the entire 4 standard works before my mission. I'll admit there were a couple portions of Ezekiel and things like that I was like, I have no idea what's going on here. But I did try to read everything. And then I went on my mission and found out some people hadn't even read the Book of Mormon once, and I was like, what? So I was really into that stuff. So after my mission, after getting married in college, I studied with the CES program and became a seminary teacher. And so I worked for CES for a little while, not a long time. I didn't get the permanent gig. That's a big deal. I'm afraid I was up against an Esplin. So there's a cohort where there was one full-time job. Okay. And me and 3 other guys, one of them whom was an Esplin, whose father was a seminary institute teacher, whose grandfather was a seminary institute teacher, and basically founded the entire CES program, basically created it, was his grandfather. The 3 of us were like, oh yeah, you're going to be temporary seminary teachers, then we're going to pick one of you for the full-time job. And yet for some reason I had the hubris to think I still might get picked, and didn't quite make it. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this other guy who did get the job, I'm not saying he wasn't an excellent teacher. He was. But looking back, I'm like, no, it was never going to happen. That was a foregone conclusion. Anyway,
that's what started all of the problems. They should have hired you as a seminary teacher.
Well, right. And I taught for a year there, and I taught early morning seminary later anyway, because I was trained. And I became a temple worker. I was a temple worker in St. George, Manti, and Taipei, Taiwan. I lived in Taiwan for a while, which was fun. So I was a temple worker in a few temples. I was a seminary teacher. I was fully invested. But then something interesting happened. They changed one of the temple ordinances. The washing and anointing went from literally actually washing and anointing to being like a well, you're not going to be washed and anointed, but we will give you this symbolic washing and anointing as follows.
So you're talking about the changes that were in my memory, like somewhat recent.
Yeah, it was like 2003 to 2005 when that changed.
Yeah,
I was like
20 years ago, something. Okay.
Yeah, I was like 24 years old. And
so
I
want to clarify for any non-Mormons, the literal washing and anointing wasn't like nudity and a bath. There was a shield and touches of water, but not.
Yeah. I mean, there used to be a bathtub thing.
That was a long time ago.
They come dusty off the trail and they just do the whole thing in the bathhouse. That made people uncomfortable with complete nudity. So then they wore like a poncho.
So you were never exposed, but I know that like one of my sisters in particular was thrilled with that change because she had been so uncomfortable with it the whole time. And so it's interesting how different people react to, because the washing and anointing never actually bothered me. I'm into like energy work and touch work. And so I was kind of like, oh, that lost something, I think
it definitely lost something. It lost something major. Now, did it make people uncomfortable sometimes? Well, yeah. But if you're not ready to have a deep, profound ritual experience, you shouldn't be entering into major ritual experiences, right? And I think that unfortunately,
I might push back on you.
Has really not prepared people properly for that.
Yes, I was going to say when you don't know what is in store and you're not able to buy in by choice, and when there are no options, because some people, like my sister, is extremely private, extremely I can see like that would have probably traumatized her. She's quite a bit older than I am. So anyway, so it's just interesting the different experiences people have. So yes, continue. I didn't mean to.
Well, and deep mystical ceremonial experiences where you have to deconstruct your identity and all kinds of things like that. Maybe that really isn't for everybody, and it's certainly not for anybody who isn't prepared to have that experience. And so the idea that the LDS Church has turned the temple into this factory process of like assembly line. Everyone has to do this, and we're going to shove everyone right through this. Is one of the reasons why, the current LDS approach to the temple is totally incompatible with what I would consider to be a full or valid temple experience. It makes no sense at all to just say, guess what, everybody, we're going to throw the mysteries at you. No, there's a reason why these mystical experiences are supposed to be for people who are entering an initiatic experience and actually prepared for that. So I'd refer to some of the psychologists. Like, if you're not ready to like read Carl Jung and talk about like the death of the ego and all that stuff, if you haven't like gotten into this, you shouldn't be entering into ritual experiences that are meant to evoke those mental and spiritual states. So.
Okay. So I think I can get on board with what you're saying in terms of, instead of it being like, you are 18, so now you're going on a mission, or now you're getting married, so therefore this is the step you go through, and it's like the necessary requirement because you're going on a mission or because you're getting married, rather than separating it from life events and just having it be, I feel the yearning and the prompting that I want to take this next step, and so I'm choosing in completely free of any other extenuating circumstance. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, and this is the big danger of turning things like the fullness of the gospel of Jesus Christ into a checklist, is that that everyone has to go through a process. Everyone becomes just a cog in a factory, shoved through something. You can't force that kind of thing. Jesus, before his ministry, had the 40-day fast in the wilderness, and he faced the devil, and he overcame, he was tempted, and can you just tell somebody, you know what, we're going to make you not eat for 40 days. We're not going to explain why. We're just going to say, you don't get to eat for 40 days. And then we're going to throw the devil at you. And we're going to tempt you with stuff. And then if you don't do it exactly the way Jesus did, we're going to say you're a failure. Like, how is that beneficial to anybody? So going on a mission, right? Going on a mission should mean that you're called. Well, a call now means that you get a letter in the mail and someone told you you're old enough now, so fill out this paperwork and go to a doctor and get a bunch of vaccines and do all these requirements, and then we're going to send you a letter, and that's your call. I thought a call meant that you felt deep in your soul a movement of the Holy Spirit upon you that fundamentally changed who you are and what you think you want in life until you were ready to sacrifice all things for the greater excellency of Jesus Christ. Put it all on the altar, experience this mighty change of heart, and then go forth to share with others the experience you've had. No, we just like, oh no, the call is now just a piece of paper. And the mighty experience or change of heart is we're going to shove you through a bunch of ceremonies that you don't understand or even want and completely aren't prepared for. And then we're going to put you out on a mission, which is literally a geographic boundary area where you're supposed to do mission stuff, which is basically just another checklist of memorize these things, say this stuff to people. I'm not saying people aren't experiencing a mighty change of heart sometimes, but when they are, I'm saying that's like incidental to the program. The program itself is not actually facilitating the purpose of religion, which should be actual experience of God.
So putting the cart behind the horse in a way, like, I mean, before the horse, it's kind of like
right.
You can experience a mighty change of heart through these experiences, but you're saying ideally the mighty change of heart comes first, and then you are called by the Lord, and then you go do the missionary work. Seek not to preach the word until you first have obtained the word, right? Instead
of just telling a kid, oh, you're 18, time to do all this stuff, and you just shove them through as though that's going to fix them or do something for them. This is one of the reasons why, it used to be pre, 1990 or so. I don't remember exactly when the statistics shifted, but it shifted somewhere in there. And people usually blame the internet, the rise of the internet for this. But there became a shift that if you served a mission, you were more likely to stay faithful and active and tithing paying your whole life. If you serve a mission, you're actually more likely to apostatize at a certain point. And I think what it is that we're shoving people through a program instead of letting them say, as a mature man, I have made this decision for myself, for my life. These 18-year-olds are not feeling like a man who has gone away from their parents and decided for themselves what their life will be. And what their life will be is that they're going to lay it on the altar and serve a mission for God because they feel moved to do so. No, you're basically taking children, shoving them through a bunch of adult experiences that even a lot of adults, most adults, never fully understand, and then assuming that they're somehow going to have this mystical change, this mystical experience in their life and go forth with that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, this is so interesting. I have so many questions. So yeah, and I hear you, and I
haven't even told my whole story yet. That was my introduction.
I know we have to come back to it. So I want to get back to it, but I do have to push back just a little bit, just because my son, I only know up close and personal my own son's experiences, and it is a more gentle type of mission because there's a president and a system and an apartment and a companion, But I do know that my sons absolutely chosen; they weren't shoved through any kind of a system. And then I watched the profound growth that they all experienced. And my third son is on my fifth child, but my third son is on his mission right now. So I did just want to. I know that people might be like, "That's not true." So I can hear.
Don't get me wrong. I had some great mission experiences too on my mission. I served in Kirkland, Ohio, which was pretty cool.
Yeah, so let's get back to I want to have you.
And on my mission, they were like, this is the barn where Fanny Alger was. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is one of the things we're talking about. And Lachlan Mackay became friends with me then, and I've met him many, many times since. And talking to
Lachlan Mackay is a member of the not the Community of Christ anymore, but he's an apostle in
Community of Christ.
Oh, is he Community of Christ? Okay, that's right. Yeah. Okay,
Lachlan Mackay, and he's a descendant of Joseph Smith. And all of that. And so, this is really important family history. It's been fun to just kind of be like, oh, what about this and what about that? Through those experiences.
Okay, so keep going. So you served a mission. You went through the seminary training program, and so you were in Utah, I guess. You were raised in Utah, and then. Yeah. Okay.
And so I actually was raised all over the West. We moved a bit. But I served a mission in Ohio. I got married. I became a temple worker. I was in Taipei, Taiwan. They changed the washing anointings. This was massive for me because, again, I was like, no, you're robbing the entire sacred nature of something when you don't do it. Let me give you something that is exactly the same thing. This isn't just an analogy. This is like the exact same thing. Is when the Catholic Church said, you know what, full immersion is probably necessary. We're going to immerse you symbolically by placing you beneath the water and pouring it over you. And then you've been symbolically immersed as follows. And so I was like, this is it. I was out of my mission, only a few years before that, right? Before all those changes happened. And in the third discussion, we talk about the great apostasy, and people say, well, give me an example. What changed? I was in the Bible Belt, basically in Ohio, right? That's the top of the Bible Belt. And there was lots of people being like, but nothing changed. Christianity's always been the same since the time of Jesus. So there's never been an apostasy. What do you mean? And this is one of the go-to examples when we were having a discussion. I'd be like, well, yeah, but the symbolic purity, the beauty, the experience of a mature adult going forth into the waters of baptism, laying their life down and being literally immersed in the water and coming forth out of the water. You can't just change that into, we're going to sprinkle a baby with water on their forehead and call that the same ordinance. It is not the same thing. And then we were doing the exact same thing in the LDS Church. We were taking what was originally many hours long, literal symbolic experience where you have to be stripped of all things. You have to lose everything. You have to be washed and anointed and prepared, and you lose everything. And then you have to go through this experience where you play a role in all of these experiences, where you approach God through all of these rituals, where you have to create the earth and you have to forget everything and you have to learn anew what it means to follow God and to approach God. And we've turned it into a symbolic thing that we do separate, and then we go in and we just watch a movie. I was like, okay, this is not the same experience at all. And I realized, oh my gosh, this is exactly the same thing. I said, this is what apostasy is. My whole mission. I was telling everybody, this is what apostasy is. And then I was watching the church that I was deeply, deeply invested in doing literally exactly the same things that I had been preaching were the definition of apostasy in former dispensations, in former times. How is it not exactly the same thing now? And I thought, oh my gosh, I think the church is following the exact same pattern and almost the exact same timeline as happened after Christ and the apostles were gone. Exactly the same thing in exactly the same timeline as happened in every other apostasy. This is what Isaiah was complaining about in his time. He was saying, you're changing the ordinances. You're breaking the everlasting covenant. And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's the same thing again. So that got me this.
Okay. Did you have this full depth of understanding at that time when you were a young man and it was changed, or has this kind of grown as because you told me you have become a master. I assume you weren't a master mason at that point, that you went to keep
right. So I'm also involved in masonry. That's a separate thing, right, than a church.
Okay.
Masonry is not a church. Church is not masonry. Masonry does not have dogmas or doctrines. Masonry is a fraternity. But yes, I'm also involved in that stuff. I was always interested in symbolism. I was always interested in experiences, rituals, things like that. I mean, even as a young man, totally committed to the LDS Church, but I still had family members that were cousins that weren't LDS. And I remember going to like a midnight mass. My mother converted from Catholicism into Mormonism, for example. And so for Christmas, I'd gone to mass a few times and seen different rituals. And I was always interested in saying, why did they do that different? Why do they do this way? So I've always been interested in that kind of thing in general, right? Because I wanted to deeply understand the world and deeply understand my own experience. It also helped my patriarchal blessing. When I was a teenager, I got a patriarchal blessing in the LDS Church, and it said, it will be important for you to study the religions and philosophies of men so that you can converse fluently with those whom the Lord will call you to teach.
Okay.
And so I always felt like, no, it's actually my duty. It's in my patriarchal blessing. I need to understand this stuff so that I can explain it in a way that is meaningful to people. Because people come from a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different backgrounds. This way I can see all those perspectives and backgrounds and communicate with people. Okay. So anyways, my fuller understanding, of course, it grows over time, but the passage from Isaiah that I quoted to you, I definitely thought about at the time. If you change the ordinances, you have broken the everlasting covenant, right? It says the earth itself is defiled under the inhabitants thereof, for they have changed the ordinance, broken the law. Transgressed the law, changed the ordinance, broken the everlasting covenant. And and this is the problem, right? The Lord makes covenants with his people, we end up breaking those covenants. When we break our covenants, I believe that we cut ourselves off from that communion with the Lord. The whole point of a covenant is to have some kind of a relationship with God. That's what a covenant means, right? Is to have a relationship. We break it from our end. The Lord doesn't break his covenants, we break ours. And so I was like, oh my gosh, if the church isn't doing this, what am I going to do? And wouldn't you know it, I became familiar with various branches of Mormonism. So let's get into that question. I have a brother. I have a relation for almost every occasion. Okay, I've got a brother who's in the community of Christ. And I have family members who've left for fundamentalism, people who've left for anti-fundamentalism, right? Like the community of Christ, people who are Catholic, all kinds of things. We're just inactive.
So is this among your siblings?
Yes.
Okay, so you were raised in this very, very devout, very scripture central way, which scripture centric way, which I was going to share some of my stories because that's really how I've raised my children as well to a large extent. And anyway, and so then so it sounds like maybe there had been discussions going on with your family
and then everyone went all different directions.
Did it start for many of you with the same change in the washings and anointings, or were some of them already had changed religions because of other things? Had they already gone to fundamentalism? Like
it was a lot of there were a lot of different things that got us thinking, but really I think the main problem was all that reading and thinking. Right?
Oh, the reading and what did you say?
Drawn to different conclusions at different times. But what was happening was we were always deeply debating everything.
Okay.
In church history, in the scriptures, in anything. Someone would say, hey, there's some apparent contradiction in scripture. And we'd be like, what? Well, we got to talk about this. We'd all debate it. And that was normal enough. And it felt safe enough when we were just all members of the LDS church. When it started fracturing, some of us started going, wait a second, no, the church isn't right. That's when we all started to panic a little bit. I mean, I feel bad for my poor mother. She's kind of decided. Her view is, I'm sticking with the church no matter what. I remember asking my mom, like, we've all gone different ways. What do you think? And she's like, I think I'm sticking with the church. And I was like, well, I get that. But like, why are you sticking with the church? And she's like, no, there doesn't have to be a why. I'm sticking with the church no matter what. I said, wait a second. Are you telling me that if like Russell M. Nelson got up and said, there is no God, our job now as members of the church is to destroy all religion. We're going to be violent. We're going to be horrible. We're going to destroy faith.
Yeah.
She's like,
I think she has the assumption that won't happen.
Well, yeah, she says, well, first of all, I don't think that it's going to go that far, but I made up my mind. I'm with him.
Oh, interesting.
I don't care. I will not question this ever. I do not.
I think
I made up my mind. This is where I made it. This is where I ended up, and this is where I'm staying. I don't want to debate it. I'll go anywhere.
Yeah. So, I do understand that. I think there are people that are like, I just want to feel safe and comfortable and not have to question every single assumption and face what that might mean for my life. I get that.
And I have to face the fact that it's a rare person that wants to put it all out there. It's a rare person that wants to question everything. And we have to face it. All of our friends and family members, we all have friends and family members who would have followed whatever because they're not going to change. They would have said the Code of Hammurabi is the greatest law ever given to man. If they'd lived at that time, they would be great patriots in World War II with the greatest generation of Americans. They would have been loyal Nazis if they'd lived in Germany. They would be loyal whatevers if that was what they were given.
Yeah.
And most of the time it's a reasonable shortcut for our brains to take, which is, if I stick with the general consensus about what everyone's telling me, what science is telling me, what community is telling me, I'm probably good. Let's just stick with the pack. That's a normal thing for most humans, I think.
I do want to touch on, and then I want you to get back to your story. I wanted to touch on how you talked about it was all the reading and discussing that kind of got you in trouble, kind of got your family in trouble in terms of.
My dad got excommunicated, and they were like, "We would encourage you to repent and go back to your scriptures." And I was like, "Excuse me, my dad should go back to his scriptures. That is the problem, not the solution."
I have said to people so many times, like people. in the LDS, the people who are more just kind of standard LDS, don't question, don't bug the system, accuse me of leading people out of the LDS church, which I think is ridiculous. But the thing that's interesting to me is I'm like, the things that are leading the people out of the church are all of like the gospel topics, essays, rough stone rolling, fair Mormon, all of the history as we write it. And then also, if they want to get rid of all anti-Mormon literature, like for me, the problem was the Book of Mormon. And then the one commandment that Jesus gives the people in the Book of Mormon is study Isaiah. And so you start studying Isaiah. And when you seriously study Isaiah, and then it goes right into Jeremiah, I believe, right? And those are not like institutional church-friendly scriptures, right?
These prophets were radicals. They were not institutionalists. They were not like, always the institution. They were like, question everything, and here's these radical revelations.
And these are the problems with institutions that are inevitable. It's like baked into the cake, right? And so I believe that is the pattern throughout life, that Jesus came and bucked the system, right? Lehi came and bucked the system. It's kind of God sent Samuel the Lamanite or Abinadi, throughout the history, it's an institution ossifies and becomes. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I totally understand that it was like, if I don't want to keep having problems, I need to stop studying the scriptures, because that's what caused my problems. That's what caused me to not have the LDS church be as good of a fit as it was previously. And that's exactly how I raised my children. Can I tell, just because it made me remember stories when you're talking about your kids, when you're talking about you guys as kids looking for seer stones instead of seashells. So just a couple of thoughts that came to my mind. So one of my little boys, when he was probably 3 or 4, it was his turn to say the family prayer. And my little boys constantly had whatever sword they needed to have, whether they were David or Ammon or Nephi, usually Nephi, and like a little leather band tied around their head. This was like the standard. This is how they lived, right? And so it was my little guy's turn to say the prayer. And my husband took away his sword and took off and he just was devastated and could not pray because his sword got taken away, And so I being the mom, the peacemaker, I was like, okay, Lincoln, look, I know you're pretending to be Nephi, and Nephi would pray when it was his turn to pray. So here, I'll give you your sword and you can hold it, but it's your turn to say the prayer, So his eyes lit up and he started to pray. Yeah. He started to pray and he said, "Oh God, please lead us across to the promised land and help my brothers to help me build the ship." Like our family prayer that night was Nephi saying the family prayer. It was the funniest. And we have all kinds of one of my kids came up and said, "Oh, Mom, your shirt is choice above all other shirts." Like this was the vernacular that they used. It was anyway.
Well, what is your native language? And people have said, well, nobody talks like that in the Book of Mormon. And I was like, I did. My brain thinks in Book of Mormon English, and then I translate it into modern American. That's my native language.
We would have dinner table conversations about Jeroboam and Rehoboam and the land northward. And I would hear my kids having these conversations. And so, so I think it's really interesting that in some ways, the more converted you are and the more sincere you are, sometimes the harder it gets to just kind of stay in the boat, right?
Well, yes. I think that the higher the expectations, the easier it is to be disappointed. I was raised so faithful that I really thought that Jesus Christ himself was sitting in the Salt Lake Temple with the First Presidency and Quorum of the 12 regularly, and that when they had some question about the wording of the Church Handbook of Instructions, they were handing it to Jesus, and he's taking his red pen and going, actually, we should word it like this, and, oh, well, where should Benjamin Shaffer go on his mission? Oh, no, don't send him there. I want him to go here. And I practically thought that on an institutional level, and here's the problem. This is the big problem of mixing the gospel, the eternal truths of God, with institutional loyalty to a bureaucracy, is that I was given this expectation that Jesus Christ himself in the body was participating in the bureaucracy.
Okay.
This was the impression that a lot of people are given in the church. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, well, the prophet, he knows the Lord. He talks to the Lord. He doesn't do anything but the Lord approves of it or tells him to do it. And then the hero worship of that, the idolatry, in my opinion, of just assuming that, oh, well, every single thing that the prophet says, he is saying as a prophet. every single thing that they say or do or anything. Like, you know what I mean? It gets to the point where it's like kiss the ring kind of attitude. Now, I recognize that I'm using those analogies that we don't do in Mormonism. And people will say, well, but we don't kiss his ring. Yeah, but we don't canonize everything that he said. We don't call him infallible. The problem is that like Catholics officially believe the Pope is infallible, officially say that the Pope is infallible, but they don't treat him like he's infallible. They question, they debate. We say that the prophet is infallible, but we treat him as though he is infallible. I mean, especially like exact obedience. We were always talking about exact obedience and this sort of thing. And it's like, oh my gosh, we treat them as though they're infallible. And so having expectations that high makes it really, really easy to be disappointed when you find that that is not the case. And at this point in my life, I started hanging out with a bunch of general authorities. Gordon B. Hinckley came to my meeting house because he was dedicating it, because we lived in Taiwan. And that's, sometimes in certain foreign areas when you're like the center of the church in that area, we went to church in what I called Temple Square of Taipei City.
Okay.
Right, is where we went to church. It was next to there's the temple and the church building. It's all kind of together. The mission home is right there. So the mission president, 70s, and as well as any visiting general authority are just going to come and visit the English-speaking ward in Taiwan, right? So I end up meeting dozens of these guys. And my expectation is they understand the gospel not only in a book learning level better than me, but also probably in a mystical, symbolic level better than me, and also probably in a direct experiences with God better than me. I think that they're going to know all this stuff. And so, my family, what do? We have all these debates about scriptural things and blah, 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 blah. And so what do I end up doing? I met Russell M. Nelson the same way, he's president now. He wasn't at the time. And I end up wanting to say, hey, what do you think about the controversy of this or that? And they weren't just not willing to take a position. It was that they did not know about it at all. Over and over and over again, any deep question I had about the gospel, about history, about doctrine, about anything, these guys weren't just carefully neutral. They were woefully ignorant, completely ignorant. And I was like, how can you not know about this? This is important stuff. What do you think it means? You told us we had to go to the temple, for example, and I wanted to talk about how ordinances fit into the scheme of exaltation. And they're like, oh, do ordinances have to do with exaltation? I never really thought about that. And I'm like, how could you not have thought about that? You're the temple president, or you're our 70 apostle here, or you are one of the 12. How did you not, you've not thought about this? Like Holland generally had thought about things. He talked to me a couple of times in Kirkland and in Taipei. He'd thought about things, but he was very cautious. But a lot of them didn't even know. And were they offended? Yes. Russell M. Nelson was deeply offended, just angry. He was like, how dare you question our authority? We were placed over you by God. And I was like, I'm not questioning your authority. I wanted to know what you thought about something that's a deep question. That's troubling to me. That's interesting to me. I thought we could have a good gospel discussion. I'm not questioning your authority. And he's like, the only type of person who would ask a question of an apostle of the Lord like me is someone who doesn't trust that I was placed by God in authority over you, and you should accept what we tell you without question. And and I was just like, oh,
was that okay? So I know you're exaggerating a bit.
I'm exaggerating a bit, but he was not happy.
Okay.
That I would dare to ask him a question. And his answer was, how dare you ask me questions? More or less.
Okay. I haven't interacted with general authorities, but I have with, I guess, like BYU scholars, retired professors, or scriptorians. And the experience I've sometimes had, because I'm similar to you, where I love the scriptures and I spent decades just devouring them all the time. And so I would have these questions because they're filled with questions, right? And so there was one time that I was speaking. I would associate with older, like old men who had spent their life studying the scriptures, and then they would tell me to go talk to someone else or go talk. So I went and spoke one time to, I believe his name was Hiram Andrus, and he was retired.
I know that is. Yeah, interesting.
Okay. And
Very
maybe I
helpful.
shouldn't say his name but so another older friend who was a mutual friend who I discussed scriptures with quite a bit said, you need to go talk to Hiram Andrus about this, because he didn't he just said maybe he'll have a good insight about this.
Mm-hmm.
So he called him, sent me over there, and it really was sort of, who do you think you are? It's kind of, it was like,
Well, no.
this is who I am. I'm this, and you do not have, you do not have the right to ask that question, because have you read everything I've ever written? Have you? And I'm like, you haven't written on this. And do you know what I mean? It was very much like, oh, I can't just sincerely engage on the scriptural question. I have to set myself up as above you and say, who do you think you are to ask that question? So is that kind of the sense it was, or was it?
That was the sense
really
I had,
like,
but I should also cut the guy a break a little bit and back up and say, you know what? He was in Taiwan. He was probably jet lagged. He was probably been pestered by plenty of other people with plenty of other things. It seemed like a more informal situation where conversation was possible, but maybe he was just cranky. I mean, people get cranky.
Okay.
Maybe it was just one of those situations where it was like, look, we're in charge, you're not.
Yeah.
And maybe he'd had a confrontational person a little bit before me. I don't know. Do you know what I mean? On these conversations, this sort of thing happens. And I don't think that anybody should judge anyone permanently based on that. I'm sure I have been cranky and condescending to people before. I try not to be, but I'm sure I've done it. And well, actually, shoot, now I can think of a couple instances where I totally did that. I had to apologize. So it happens, right? It happens. And so I don't want to blame him and say that it's the worst thing ever just because I had one bad experience. But
I will also validate, though, that there definitely is, just like with Hiram Andrus, and like this sense of, who are you to ask me a question? Yeah. Like that's not how we do things here. And we'll give you what you need to know, and you don't need to think beyond that. So so I can see the interchange.
Yeah, so that sort of thing does happen, you know what I mean? And just the fact that he's the president of the church right now makes that a little bit tricky. And I also have some very, very hard feelings now, which may color that, about him demolishing the Salt Lake Temple. I mean, personally, it's like, look, no matter what you believe, no matter what religion you're a part of, destroying a World Heritage Site is a crime against humanity. All of humanity is poorer for what he has done, being a temple destroyer. Okay. It is not appropriate for anyone to do anything like that to any religious site of any faith. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, but so let me ask you, plenty of people saying, it's totally fine, because he's the president of the church. I'm like, why is it fine? Because he's the president of the church. If ISIS had done that, if Osama bin Laden had done that, we'd all be like, how dare they? But now, because he's the president of the church, it doesn't matter. It's like, oh my gosh.
Yeah. Let me again just push back a little bit, because what if, as from my research, it looks like to me, he learned that the temple was not structurally sound because the foundation was poor, and it needed, like my understanding is they're actually trying to keep it standing and going to extreme expense to not let it be destroyed. And so it's a massive renovation, not a destruction. Like that's a different. And so I'm
if it was about the seismic upgrades that occurs on the foundation, that occurs in the walls, you don't have to drive a bulldozer through the ordinance rooms in order to.
They do that? You don't have to gut the building.
You do not have to take all of our ancient pioneers' art and throw it away without even cataloging it. The final pictures,
I didn't know.
The final pictures of the ordinance rooms in the Salt Lake Temple were taken by construction workers on their cell phones before they were told to break it all down.
Really? Okay, that's
so no. We're talking about a real destruction here, and I think it's an absolute blasphemy. And again, I think it's a crime against heritage. And I think he did it because he wants to change these ordinances. Here I was in Taiwan. They'd just taken out this washing and anointing. How do you have the center place, the middle of your faith, be a temple and a tabernacle and a church office building? How do you have at the core of the church a building covered in symbology, built with symbology that you deny, that you changed? How do you do that? How do you welcome people into this temple at the very center of it all and say, oh, we don't do that anymore. We want to do this other thing now.
So, okay. So I want to keep, we'll just have the discussion as we go.
It's built to do ordinances that they don't even perform anymore.
Okay. So so I'm hearing you, and I do want to keep going with your story. But
Sorry, yes.
one thing I think it's really interesting when different people, because the ordinances have again recently been changed.
Sure.
And
In fact, I think this is one of the most shocking things. I've talked to some people from the church office building about this. One of the reasons why it's not a movie anymore, why you don't see their mouths move, is because there's actually a program to make changes every February or March, to roll them out every year. It's an ongoing, so they're not just, oh, something happened and we might make a change this year. No, they're making changes every year until they feel that they've gotten it right. So until they do that, they're not going to make a regular, a full long form video where you can see their mouths move, because they might want to change the lines.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Okay. That's interesting. Yeah. And I'm sure there are lots of thought processes to it, but even the movie thing is interesting, because all of a sudden it's, when you make a movie, you have to build in all of the meaning. You have to make so many decisions. Even the actors make decisions. Whereas when it's just an old couple, it's obviously clearly symbolic, right? So it's easy to misinterpret even making a movie. So it's challenging. But the thing that I wanted to ask you, because I think it is interesting when people have a real sort of concern about something being changed in the temple, because I think that this teaching from Isaiah is ancient, and the temple has never, even the LDS temple has never been static. It has changed and changed and changed and changed from the beginning. It wasn't even written down until the end of Brigham Young's life, right? And so, and then whatever was happening in Nauvoo, which wasn't finished during Joseph Smith's lifetime, or really ever, and then whatever was happening in St. George, like, it wasn't static. I wanted, there are some questions I want to ask. But for example, Brigham Young instituted an hour-long lecture at the Veil that was all about Adam-God theory, right?
It's not a full hour, but it's fairly long.
But I mean, that's just one of so many, and there used to be the oaths of vengeance. And then we've had like there have been many, many changes. And so to me, these more recent changes aren't earth-shattering and aren't a big deal, because it's like, I'm like, it's happened from the beginning, especially if we compare the ancient temples, Solomon's temple to Herod's temple. Those were very different. Herod's temple to the Restoration temples, like to the Kirkland Temple, completely different. The Kirkland Temple to later Utah temples, completely different. So that's why for me, it's like, oh, this is an ongoing pattern that the ordinances that God gave us are much deeper, much more profound, and we've all changed them. If that makes sense.
I do think that there is a lot of change that does occur over time, because I believe a true temple is a house of learning. And so there's going to be a lot of different instructions. So things like the contents of a lecture, I think are going to change a lot of different times. In fact, I would describe some of Jesus's lectures, Jesus's sermons in the New Testament as being lectures at the Veil. He even gave some of them in the temple, for example. And so there are temple texts, people call them, in the Bible, things that it's like, this is alluding to a priestly tradition. This is one of the things that's really big in textual criticism. They talk about how they think that the Bible is a conglomeration of different traditions and different documents. So there's the J document, which is the Jehovah tradition, the E document, the Elohim tradition, things like that, right? Well, there's also the P document, the priestly tradition. And there's this belief that, for example, the rabbinical, the Pharisees, essentially at the time of Jesus, that they were following the Deuteronomist tradition, the D document, and that they were trying to have certain kinds of literalism about the law, and that Jesus, having gone to Egypt and experienced the Egyptian mysteries, and maybe even Jewish Egyptian temples in Egypt, was actually forming a part of this priestly tradition. And that's one of the reasons why they emphasized in Jesus' genealogies, for example, in Luke and Mark, that he came from a priestly bloodline. So he was a Levite, he was a Judahite, he was all of these things. Why did they want that to be the case? They're trying to point out he is a restorationist. He is not just your average Jew who happens to live somewhere in Galilee. He is a priestly tradition. And that's why in the New Testament, they focus on Jesus is our great high priest. Why talk about him as a priest? Because they want to say, look, we split from Judaism, not over Jesus. When Jesus came, that wasn't the breakoff. between us and the Jews. The breakoff was further back. The breakoff happened before the Maccabean revolt, before the profanation of the temple. We're part of the priestly tradition that has all of these mysteries, and that's why Christianity had this Gnostic traditions and these mystical traditions earlier on. Was based on this idea. And so, yes, I do think there are changes over time, but here's what I don't think changes over time. Every human being has to make the same sacrifice. The lectures on faith, which in my church we still believe are canonized scripture. The lectures on faith, lecture 6, famously says that religion, which does not require the sacrifice of all things, never had the power sufficient to produce the faith necessary for life and salvation. Everyone has to bring an offering to the altar. Everyone has to make a certain sacrifice. In other words, everyone has to enter the same covenant relationship with God that Adam, Enoch, Noah, Moses, Abraham did. You have to enter the Abrahamic covenant. And so even though methods of instruction or explanations can change over time, I do believe that the covenants remain the same throughout all eternity. And that is why I think that it is not inappropriate for us to say, as I believe at least, that the temple is to help us that understand mysteries that were had from the foundations, before the foundations of the earth. Temple ceremonies may have some different modes of instruction. If somebody went through a temple covenant relationship experience where they sacrificed all earthly things and they came into the presence of God, and during that, their lecture at the veil was slightly different than Brigham's lecture, I would not consider that an invalid temple ordinance, okay? So there's certain things that we do word for word. Like,
okay. So let me ask,
that are flexible.
Okay. So what era of temple did you follow for your temple? Is it like circa 1890, circa 1904?
It's very circa 1877.
1877. Okay.
But with influence from 1923. So there are
Okay.
let me give you a really, well, I know this can get long, but I'm given long.
Yeah, just be brief.
Do the very brief. And that is, okay, 1830s, there's something starting for sure. And there's Hebrew words and there's covenants and there's talk about God and the school of the prophets and washing his warnings, stuff like that. Up to 1840s, then you get into stuff where there's more like ritualized something going on. The Quorum of the Anointed is a book I would recommend to everyone that Devery Anderson is the compiler on. Lots of interesting temple history there about what was going on in Nauvoo. None of that gets written down. That becomes the Strangite Temple, the Alpheus Cutler's Temple, Lyman White's Temple, Brigham Young's temples. It isn't until 1877 that it gets written down. Ours is very
Brigham Young, the Brigham's Temple.
by Brigham Young.
Do you have access to it? Because we don't have access to the 1877 version, do we? Or at least not the temple at the veil, lecture at the veil.
This is an interesting point about breakoffs, maybe, to answer that, which is who broke off of whom. I didn't really understand this at first, and I'll go back and tell my story about how I realized this, but I realized everybody in the Restoration thinks that they're the original branch. Everybody thinks, well, we know. You know what I mean?
We're the one true.
We're the one true, you know, and it turns out that we do have and so what do I claim? I claim that we have an unbroken chain of people who did it with people who did it with people who did it with, all the way back to Joseph Smith. And we think that ours is accurate because of that. But yes.
So yours is the one true. Okay. Okay. Just like
We're Brighamites. And so, yes, we think Brigham knew what he was talking about when he put together the 1877. And we do know some of that because we have our own unbroken tradition. So if the mainstream church says we don't have that, well, it's because they broke off from us. That I would say.
Or they might say you can't have that. That's sometimes what.
And I would say we've been doing it from the beginning. So what are you gonna do about it?
Okay.
We're just continuing.
Okay, so
we're just observing our religion and continuing on as we always have. So I don't care if you're upset about that when you broke off from us. We're just doing what we're doing. So, but anyways, so 1923 is also still common history, and 1923. The big difference between 1877 and 1923 is 1877 is an outline. It is not a full script. It says things like the preacher will teach sectarianism to help the participants understand that what they were taught in religion in their former faiths was an incomplete understanding of the gospel, is basically what it says. I'm paraphrasing. It doesn't say, these are the lines that the preacher will say, right? 1923, they get lines. It standardizes.
Okay.
We generally follow 1923, but 1923 was in most respects comported with 1877, except that they cut down the lecture at the veil to be much shorter. And in 1923, they took out the oath of vengeance. Well, we still have the oath of vengeance, and we still have actually a longer lecture at the veil than Brigham Young used. But we include most of Brigham Young stuff. They shortened that in 1923 and got rid of the oath of vengeance. We still have those, but beyond that, we actually use the lines they added in 1923 generally. Okay, so I'm so curious about this. So Heber J. Grant was the church president in 1923. Yes. Fundamentalists generally do not hold with Heber J. Grant. He's the first one that we would say was a president of the church, a bureaucracy, an institution, the kind of institution that Jeremiah and Isaiah would not have approved of, for example, and that the gospel and the priesthood were separate from, not entirely separate from the church at that time, but that he certainly was not leading the church spiritually, only bureaucratically. Okay. Yeah, that's what like fundamentalists in general are like. Heber J. Grant is when it was over. There's no more. That was a big line in the sand was Heber J. Grant. Yeah. Right. And so it's interesting that though is when the temple was written that you do except so it's all just interesting how it comes together. Well, but again, I would say that those parts that were outlines in the 1877 version and got strict lines in 1923, I would say those things can change. There can be some evolution in our understanding. Sure. That was just one take on how to present the concept. But what is important is the concept, is the covenant. That's what's important. So how does your temple recommend process work? If someone was like, I want to experience an original Utah temple experience, can someone come? You're invited. Even you. You're all invited. Absolutely. Please come. Even me. Even like Satan incarnate gets to go. Okay. I mean, it might be a really uncomfortable experience for you, but you are more than welcome to come and. So you don't have a temple recommend? No, we do. We do. And of course, this is one of the other things too, is we believe in like rebaptism. So yeah, part of it is you would be rebaptized. There would be a lot of things that you'd go through. But we do want everyone who wants to have the opportunity to do that. We don't ask you to renounce your membership in some other church. That's not our business either. I think doesn't the LDS temple president if you're in Nevada. Now, of course, if the Strength in the Church Members Committee watches your blog, watches this video, they may get upset about this. So please just leave the guy alone. But technically, some of our temple workers, including our temple president in Nevada, who recently did a great interview on gospel tangents, they have an interview. They sit in the baptistry and do an interview. In our temple. Yeah, Rick told me about that. The temple president there is still a member of record, as far as I understand. I don't think he's ever been excommunicated or anything. From the mainstream, yes. So people could. Okay, do you do the full bathtub washing or do you do the shield? We do a shield. We do use more water and more gestures and things like that than probably you were familiar with in, say, I don't know, the 90s is probably when you went through. Okay. It's more complete than that. It's more like the 1970s and before. Okay. But so no, we don't need a basin. There isn't that much water. Okay. Okay. So that's good. That's good for people to know. But even Wilford Woodruff, as president of the St. George Temple, actually wrote in the St. George Temple book that he said, I've instructed them that if they use so much water that it must be wiped away, or so much oil that it must be cleansed before they can proceed, that it diminishes from the sacredness of it. And if we understood the sacredness of the anointing, we would not want to wipe it off so easily. In other words, even in Wilford Woodruff's time, who knew Joseph Smith personally, he was saying, we're not like a whole bucket of oil on somebody's head where they're going to have to shower after this just before they can even get dressed or even get ready for anything. Was not the case. So I think we're doing it about the way Wilford Woodruff was. Okay, that's fascinating. So I do want to just kind of briefly get from where these temple changes were made. Did you get into the Journal of Discourses? What did you, and you had siblings who already were fundamentalists. Right. You were already hearing. Yeah. Finish us out with how. Okay, so back to my story. Converted. I was worried about the loss of these things.
Sure.
And I asked the temple president, well, why are we doing this? And he said, well, some people found it uncomfortable before. More people will be willing to do it now. And I was like, well, sure, but do we want to do this just to dumb it down because people aren't prepared? Maybe we should just be preparing people better, And he's like, well, we shouldn't question the brethren and stuff like that. And there was also talk of a lawsuit that somebody had filed a lawsuit against the church, and they were trying to get that settled. And they decided they wanted to avoid this kind of thing in the future where someone said, oh yeah, they made me go to the temple and they made me get naked and then someone touched me, and they made it sound really creepy. And I mean, I don't know if their experience was creepy or if they were just trying to make it sound creepy, but they tried to make it sound horrible and scary. And so the church was like, how do we just nip this in the bud and get rid of this was the reasoning. And it was all bureaucratic and it was all legal. And I was like, where's the revelation? Where's the meaning in this? And I said, well, it's not just this. What about the oath of vengeance? What about the law of adoption? What about the second endowments and second anointings? What about all this stuff? And he's like, well, we don't do any of that anymore, basically. And he's like, and I don't even have it. I've never done any of that, said the temple president. I was like, well, if you haven't received it, how can you give it? He's like, we don't, it's not, you can't.
You'd already been reading the Journal of Discourses so you were already kind of a converted polygamist in like as Brigham said, you have to be a polygamist at least in your faith, right? You already
just
kind of there.
Right? Yeah, of course I was a polygamist.
Brigham did too.
Oh, okay. Did he? Okay. Of course I was a polygamist in my faith. I was a member of the church. I'm sorry, but in order to get a temple recommend, they asked me if I sustained the prophets, seers, and revelators. And I said yes. And what that meant to me was, of course I accept all of those statements, including plural marriage. That's a requirement. Like, you're not faithful if you don't believe in what the prophets teach. And that's what they teach,
but
right?
President Hinckley, he would have been, let's see, what year was this that you kind of...
right, yeah. No, President Hinckley was all like, oh, I don't know that we teach it. And I'm like, well, of course you don't. Because
he also said he condemns it. He condemns it completely because it's not doctrinal. And so anyway, so I think I'm in very good standing to say it's not doctrinal,
Right, because he said so.
President Hinckley said it as the president of the church. So I'm not far afield from what, But anyway, right. Okay, so it wasn't a hard sell for you to say, okay, I see the problems in the church, so I'm going to live the gospel more fully, which for you meant a fundamentalist approach.
Well, and mostly it meant the temples. And here's the problem, is that I talked to some fundamentalists, and they were all like, oh, we don't have temples.
Yeah.
We don't do temples, we do polygamy. And this is actually the dangerous nature of breakoffs, is that in a lot of cases, the reason why people break off is the only reason why their church continues to exist. They get a pet doctrine, they get a favorite thing, and then they break off because of it, and then that becomes their whole shtick. And they don't really get it all anymore. They don't do the whole gospel. They bang on one key, and they're like, this is our thing.
But that's my sense of early Utah polygamist Mormonism, because Brigham didn't build a temple until he died, right? The first temple finished was St. George in what was it? In
1877, the same year he died.
And the same year he died. And so throughout those Utah years, throughout all of Brigham Young's reign is not the right word, but his ministry.
Reign might be a good one. A kingdom,
Yeah, but it was, it was the kingdom, but throughout his I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but when he was the president, there wasn't a temple. And polygamy, when you read through the discourses, they were not teaching temple, they were teaching polygamy, right? And Brigham's other doctrines. And so I'm sympathetic with fundamentalists that go that direction, because that is in keeping with what Brigham established.
I disagree with you there. There was so much temple stuff going on. Merchants Flat between like Junction and Beaver is like this little place where people would meet over the top of the mountain and do temple ordinances and weddings up there.
They have the endowment house, and but you know what I'm saying.
Not just the endowment house. They did endowments on Ensign Peak. They did endowments in Spring City at what they called ended up calling the Spring City Tabernacle, which is still there. It's a little stone building that was
beautiful. I've been there.
Press office or something, and all kinds of places. So, the difference was is that they didn't think they needed a special building to do it. They just
did. They just didn't finish it. They knew, like Brigham was very much wanting to build a temple. I think that there were foundational problems. So he built St. George instead so we could leave it as a legacy, I think. But anyway, I guess I'm just saying I'm sympathetic with fundamentalists saying, no, the gospel is about polygamy, because that really does seem to be in keeping with those early Utah years throughout Brigham Young's ministry. So, okay. So anyway, but anyway, I just...
Temples were the thing for me. For sure.
Yes, sure.
Okay. I was like, I want to find temples.
Well, and Joseph taught temples for sure. It was part of the restoration for sure.
Okay. So I reached out to the Community of Christ. I was like, I'm really upset that we don't have washings and anointings. Do you have washings and anointings? And they're like, no. And I reached out to Mormon Fundamentalists. I said, do you guys have, I'm worried about these washings.
The Community of Christ doesn't have washings and anointings, because that was very much the 30s. That was very much Kirkland. And I thought that that's interesting. So, okay, continue. I just didn't
honestly, they don't do baptisms for the dead. They don't even believe baptisms for the living.
But that's a later Nauvoo. Baptisms for the dead is a later Nauvoo innovation. And I know they don't keep to the Nauvoo doctrines, but the early Kirkland ones. So that's interesting that they don't even do washings and anointings. Okay.
Now, I mean, this is an aside, but since we're on it, I went through the Kirkland Temple with Lachlan many times, like I said. And at one point we did a temple walk, he called it, where there were stations that we could go through progressively as we go through symbolic understandings, essentially, and different scriptures presented at each different place, so that we could have this experience going through like as though we were approaching God. And by the time we were done with it, I was like, I've been through the endowment in the Community of Christ. And he's like, we don't do endowments. And I was like, what was that? What was that?
Okay.
And it was beautiful. It was really beautiful experience. I loved it. But he's like, oh yeah, but we don't believe it's required for exaltation. And I was like, I think a lot of people don't understand endowments anyway. But what did you do? You gave us a beautiful scriptural symbolic journey as we experience not only our history and the history of our people, but the history of godliness as we approach the divine. That's an endowment. I was like, straight up, this is an endowment, man. And he's like, well, we don't use that term. We're not going to use that term. But anyways, at the time,
now I want to go do that too. Okay,
it was beautiful. It was beautiful.
Yeah.
One of the things that really breaks my heart is that the LDS Church bought it, and I just don't know that I'm going to feel so welcome there as I used to. It used to be that I could go there, and whether it was Seth Bryan or Lachlan McKay or somebody else, I could just be like, hey, I'm home. And they're like, hey, Benjamin, welcome home to the beginning of the restoration. The whole family, all the branches of the restoration are welcome here. This is part of our heritage, our combined heritage. And I'm afraid that that's not going to be the attitude the mainstream LDS Church is going to take, that this is part of our combined heritage. I'm afraid they're going to be like, this is ours, not yours, get out. That's what I'm afraid is going to happen. And it's like,
a lot of us are praying that we keep it an open, respectful space. Yeah.
Hopefully, open, respectful space is what I would like to see. And I'm grateful that it's now in the church history department that's in charge instead of the missionary department. So maybe they'll take a different approach. We'll have to see how that all plays out. Yeah. But basically, I'm going to go there on pins and needles a little bit to see what happens next time I show up. Yeah. But okay, so anyways,
I've had several conversations with John Hayek about it as well, because he's really hoping that they don't restore it, which when Mormons do restoration, it's really renovation, right? And so he just wants to preserve it, not restore it, because like when you said, this is Fanny Alger's barn. No, that's a modern recreation of the barn, right? It's not. Yeah. And like
the Newell K. Whitney store and the John Johnson Inn in Kirtland are perfect examples of this. The church bulldozed the John Johnson Inn. Nobody cared. And then they tried to rebuild it, but they made it into like a visitor center museum kind of space. It's just, on the outside, it looks similar. It's near the same spot. I'm like, there's no kind of historical respect here. They tore down. There was a staircase on the side of the Newell K. Whitney store that went up into the School of the Prophets room. They tore it down. Joseph Smith and those with him built that staircase so that you wouldn't have to go through Emma's kitchen or the storeroom or some random place that you didn't belong to go to and from the School of the Prophets. They built it there so that you could stand at the door and raise your hands and give the salutation on this little porch so that you could enter they tore it down. Because they were like, but we don't want people to enter separate entrances like Joseph Smith would have wanted naturally for the practicality of using that room as a schoolhouse. Okay. We wanted we wanted a place where you could walk in the front door of the store and then loop through all of the dwelling areas, storage areas, store
They
areas.
turned it into IKEA, where you have to follow the path.
Yeah, we wanted to have a flow. So we're going to tear down the staircase that separated it. And instead, we're going to put a staircase right through the middle. We're going to tear out walls. We're going to tear out part of the revelation room. We're going to tear out part of the storeroom to put in a staircase that didn't belong there so that you can IKEA your way through this instead of having separate discrete sacred spaces.
It is interesting. It's just different priorities, because there's kind of a desire to teach our narrative and to make it very, we want more people coming. So it's a missionary tool to teach our narrative rather than a historical, it wasn't, it was used in a utilitarian way for what our purposes are now, rather than respected as its own state. So its own thing. And I hope the Kirkland Temple is different. So
I hope
build next to it. Like, here are the actual buildings, and over the next block over, or the next town over, we're going to build the Disney version of church history sites, which is kind of what we have, but leave the originals alone.
Well, here's the problem. And here's a problem that you and I both face all the time, even though we come to different conclusions about it. The Disneyland version is no one will respect it unless they tear down the original. Nobody. And so, look, you and I have a very different idea about what historical revisionism is when it comes to Joseph Smith's life. But if you want to make an empty suit that you can fill up with whatever you want and say, that's Joseph Smith, we have the original because we have made Joseph Smith into our image so that he does what we want. He says what we want. He parrots our talking points. Then what do you have to do? You have to obscure the actual truth. You have to obscure what the real history was. Now, you and I disagree heavily on what the real history was, but I think, which makes me accuse you of making the Disneyland version, probably makes you accuse me of making the Disneyland version, but that's why the church could never do that, because they have their own Disneyland version. And so long as the original exists at all, people are going to ask some really uncomfortable questions to them that they don't want to have to answer. And that's where I think we were at with the Salt Lake Temple and why it's been demolished. The whole interior has been demolished, because you can't go in there and say, oh yeah, the endowment is this thing that we are doing a new way in 2024 or 2025, or maybe even by 2027, it'll be almost unrecognizable to anybody who's going through the temple today. You can't do that and then have people say, well, why this? Why is that symbol here? Why were we going through a room that looked like that? Why was there a room that looked all gardeny, and nature-ish?
Well,
and then they'll also be like, well, we used to have this thing where you used to pretend to be Adam and Eve, and you used to go and do this stuff. And then it's like, they don't want to keep answering those questions. They have to destroy it. And honestly, if I may be so bold, this goes back to, I think, something very scriptural, from the Book of Mormon. He says, I'll give you the way to judge. That which promotes faith, that which promotes life, that which leads to liberty, those things are of God. And if it is captivity and death by the captivity and power of the devil, if it denies life, if it destroys life, those things are, you may know with perfect knowledge that they're not of God, they're of the devil. And I'm sorry, but this is one of the reasons why I judge these things so harshly, because it tends to death. It does not tend to life. It tends to destruction. And if it tends to destruction, I don't believe it's of God. It should bring forth more life, more love, more family, more truth. And I don't think you get to more truth by tearing down the monuments of your ancestors. I don't think you get to more truth by denying these things.
Okay, that's so interesting. See, I think because a core part of that also is if it leads to Christ, if it leads to believe in Christ and to have faith in Christ is kind of the center of all that, as well as the other things you listed. And so that's part of why I think that seeing the original things like you're talking about is essential because of the questions it raises. Yeah. And for me, that's been the journey with the Joseph Smith papers. That's why I think the Joseph Smith papers are so crucial, because that's why just so you know, I was, well, and we should kind of move on with the conversation, but
maybe we can get into the doctrine and the history.
Yeah, I was a polygamist at heart my whole life until I started really studying the scriptures. And I was like, oh, Joseph was wrong about polygamy. It wasn't of God. That was my first transition. Again, I got in trouble through reading the scriptures. That's what got me in trouble.
Right, but then
it
but your
wasn't
first
until
thought
the
was, oh
Joseph
no,
Smith
Joseph
papers.
Smith was fallen. But you
What
don't
did you say?
But so your first thought was, oh, this means Joseph was fallen. He was a fallen prophet. He was wrong.
Nope, I didn't think that actually. That's not where I went at all.
I thought that's what we were just saying.
No, where I was on it was I knew that Joseph wasn't doing the same thing that Brigham was doing. It was clearly different. You know, Joseph didn't have children, and I mean, but I thought he got involved in it. Okay. I thought he got involved in it. So I thought he lost his spiritual protection, and that's why he was unable to be killed, based on some conversations I had with some other.
But that's not the same thing as a fallen prophet, you're saying.
No, it wasn't a fallen prophet. It was just, he got tangled up in this, which is contrary to God, and he was allowed to be killed, and the people, got what they wanted. Like it wasn't a faith crisis for me at all. And so actually what was hard, it was hard for me because I in my teaching in homeschool communities and in my, I was friends with several polygamists, and we agreed on so many things. So it was hard for me to come out and say polygamy was never of God. I burned a lot of bridges there, which was painful for me, and then it wasn't until I'd been studying it for a long time, deep in the Joseph Smith papers, where I was like, holy cow, Joseph didn't do this. Holy cow, he was fighting it. It's true. Oh my gosh. And then that was really hard to come out and say that, because I knew I would lose all credibility with all of the people that are so certain that the history settled. So anyway, just to let you know.
Yes, and I'm sorry, that's kind of where my reluctance comes from being on 132 Problems, is I'm like, no, the history is settled. There's literally entire libraries of books. And the Joseph Smith Papers Project, which I think make it excessively undeniable that this did occur. I mean, you can have any viewpoint you want about what it means. You can believe that it means Joseph was a false prophet, or Joseph was a true prophet, or that Joseph Smith was bad, or that Joseph Smith was good, or anything you want. You can even believe, I think consistently, that polygamy is not of God, never was. But what you can't do is you can't change the facts of what actually happened. And as far as I can tell, that is so well settled that, yeah, for me, it's like debating flat Earth or whether or not birds are real.
Right. I've heard all these. So here's what I propose. Let's schedule a second time if we want to, where we can have the discussion about we could have a great discussion on the history of polygamy, whether it's, I think there are two parts to the discussion, because that's how my journey went. Is it of God? And was Joseph the original?
Well, and that is
those
important.
Are the two questions.
Those two questions are so important, because it's like, okay, as a polygamist, I'm like, okay, first of all, it is definitely of God.
Okay.
Definitely. It's the most holy principle. This is a very sacred thing. Therefore, trying to say that Joseph, out of all the other prophets that I believe had polygamy, and all the scriptures that I think fit into this context, it's almost pointless, because even if you convinced me that Joseph Smith was never a polygamist, I'd be like, oh wow, well I guess he was a fallen prophet then. Either that, or I should throw away the whole Bible. I mean, I see polygamy in a lot of places that maybe you don't, that I'm sure you don't, because and I'm like, it's right in there. So can we still have the scriptures? Like, there's a lot to separate there. And really, a lot of it comes down to those first assumptions. Being as that I am a minister of 70, in a church that believes in and practices plural marriage, I'm like, this is really important stuff. And I can recognize lots of problems. I can recognize that there are contradictions. I can recognize that there have been abuses and mistakes and problems and all kinds of things in our history. But I have to reconcile that into saying, yes, but that doesn't mean the gospel is not true. That doesn't mean Jesus wasn't the Christ. And to me, that's all part of that, right?
So that's how it stacks for you. Okay, so polygamy is in the foundation of Jesus being the Christ for you.
Well, sure. I mean, Jesus was a polygamist, as far as I can tell from a lot of records, including the Bible. It seems to indicate heavily to me that was the case. And so, yeah, it's part of the whole worldview, right? Like when I pray and I talk to God, is God a polygamist? Well, yeah. And here's one of the big things that's coming up this week with Pentecost. This is the time of Pentecost this week. Is that we have this analogy over and over again, especially in the New Testament, that Christ is the bridegroom and we are the bride, right? That Christ and his church is the example of the idealized marriage, that marriage is like the symbol of our covenant relationship with God. Well, thank goodness God's a polygamist. I want to go to heaven, and I bet you do too. And if he was a monogamist, he'd be like, everyone but Jesus, get out. I'm a monogamist. I don't allow anyone else in my kingdom because I don't have enough love for any more than one person. It's like, no.
Well, let me ask you a question. The bride is the church, right?
Yeah.
How many true churches are there?
Well, we are the church. And so I would say all of mankind is the number you should be roughly going for. It's like 100 billion, hopefully.
No, I'm saying the bride isn't each individual person. The bride is the church.
Well, that sounds very much like you're more in favor of the institutional bureaucracy then, because I don't see the bride as a single.
I define church differently. Those who are Christ's are part of the church, and there's one church, right? We are told often that there is one church, which I think makes us have to redefine what church means. But Jesus Christ as the groom uses the covenant symbol of a husband and wife, right? Groom and bride. But the bride is the church, and there is one church. That is a pretty common doctrine.
So you'd make that kind of monogamous. And my point is that you're doing that because you're starting from the assumption that polygamy is a bad thing. And I'm starting from the assumption that my whole community is polygamous. Of course, it's a good thing. This is our family. These are our loved ones, right? We don't think that our loved ones.
And as I said,
we love our families.
I did start with the assumption that polygamy was a good thing. It shook me massively.
And I'm just saying that I'm not going to convince you this moment, but I am saying that our assumptions do change the way that we read these things, change the way we view them. When I see the fact that God makes this covenant with all of Israel, when the church is the bride of Christ, I see massive polygamy here. Like that is like the whole point. This is the ultimate polygamous marriage. Jesus is all the 10 virgins. Literally 10 wives for the bridegroom is literally like laid out with numbers of brides, and literally that 5 of them married him and 5 of them weren't worthy to marry him. It's like, there's so much polygamy here.
Let me ask then, is it 10 or is it 5 or is it 7? Because Isaiah, for one, it's 7, right? So we have some number problems going on if we're going to interpret things this way.
Okay, I see how you just make that a contradiction. I'm just going for the plural versus singular here. I'm just saying, if God uses polygamy as an example of righteousness all over the place, I just don't see how it's a problem if people actually believe him. But that's because I'm coming from the assumption of polygamy, and you're coming from an assumption of monogamy, or at least now you are. Maybe you haven't always, right? And that it colors the way you read something. This is something that I was saying to you at the wedding when we met, that is such a big deal. Like, what is the default matters. It makes a huge difference in the way people approach these things. A lot of people will say, oh, I don't want polygamy because I don't want to share my husband. Instead of coming from the perspective of, which I come from, which is like polygamy, which is more of a, well, I certainly hope that I will be able to be part of this family. I don't imagine myself being the first. I imagine myself being the second or the third. The assumptions that you go into it are, oh, I don't want to let more people into this family, is a monogamous assumption. A polygamous assumption is more like, I hope that my family will accept me and love me. And so monogamy looks really hateful from a polygamous point of view usually, because it's like, wait, you're telling me that no one's going to love me? You're telling me that I'll be thrown out of my own family? You're telling me I'll be disowned?
I hear what you're saying. Those just don't resonate with me. Those aren't my, like,
it doesn't resonate with you because you come from a different default. That's the default I come from. Someone says, oh yeah, I believe in monogamy. And I'm like, oh, that's so sad. Did you get thrown out of your family? Did you get divorced? In fact, there was a polygamist making this joke to me yesterday, which I thought was really great. He was excommunicated from the LDS Church, and he is an active practicing polygamist. And someone said, wait, are you in the mainstream church? And he's like, the problem is that the church just loves divorce more than I do, and they really want to see more divorces. And I don't have enough divorces to be in good standing with them. And he goes, wait, are you telling me you're a polygamist? And he's like, yes. Because the church doesn't, at least the church handbook of instructions right now, puts no limit on the number of wives I can have, so long as I divorce all but one of them. Then I'm allowed to be in good standing with the church, but I'm not willing to throw away any family members. I love them. I don't want to get rid of them. And so I'm just not divorced enough. Or death. They love death in the church. The church just doesn't think that enough of my wives have died. That's the problem. They want to kill one of my wives or more of my wives until there's only one left. Then I could be in good standing with the church because they love death more than they love my family. And it's just like, ouch, what a perspective. And I recognize monogamists don't come from that perspective. They assume that the default is monogamy and that polygamy is this exception that could happen to them. There would be this horrible fate. Instead of thinking like, no, that's the default. That's what we already have. What are you going to do to destroy our family is all that I see. And I don't want my family.
Yeah.
I love my family.
And well, don't you have one wife?
I do have one wife.
Okay. So, I mean, I should say, but one wife. You have but one wife at this point, right?
I have but one wife.
Okay. I needed to clarify for Brian Hale's sake and others. So again, I'm wondering which direction to go, because it would be fascinating to have the polygamy, monogamy discussion. But let's stick with these other topics now, and then we can see if we have time after, or we could schedule a second time. I'm like, I don't know if I want to get into the
sure.
I think it's a great discussion to have. But what we spend our
time is part of marriage. If you believe that now and later and past and future have some relevancy on what marriage is, then I guess I'm a polygamist because I'm divorced and remarried. So I have two wives, just one of them in the past and one of them in the present. But I don't think that matters in a Mormon viewpoint.
So you think your wife that didn't want to be married to you anymore, I assume, or that you didn't want to be married to anymore, is your wife eternally?
Well, it already happened. You can't just erase the past. We have 4 daughters together. I mean, it's real. It's a thing. I don't think that past, present, and future really exist for God or for marriage. I am married to her in the past. That's a place where I exist, where she exists, where our children exist. And to deny that marriage would be to deny reality. It's a thing. It happened. If all things are one eternal now, it's happening now.
Okay. So that's a very slippery answer, because I think we can agree that we are dwelling in time right now, right? And
I think we're in the midst of eternity. It's just a matter of limited perspective. The ego mind wants to latch onto these things in order to separate us from the ultimate reality. But the ultimate reality, I think, is real.
Okay. All right. So I won't press that. So let's go here for a minute. I am curious about a couple of things. I just wanted to ask, because some of the doctrinal points you've brought up already, I encountered them in Ogden Kraut. He's, from my familiarity, he's one of the main polygamy scholars, right?
Oh, yeah.
And then as I studied, I realized that almost everything Ogden Kraut said, or practically everything, there aren't that many exceptions, are actually from Orson Pratt. So he was the original polygamy scholar. So I wanted to know if there's someone that you recognize now that's like the cutting edge polygamy scholar who is respected and looked to as.
Yeah, Don Bradley.
Okay.
Like Don Bradley has touched more of the original documents than any other person living.
Okay.
And
so now
he did a lot of that work for Brian Hales. So a whole lot of that was turned, and Don Bradley's doing some great work for the Church History Department right now, is my understanding. So, but yeah, I'd point to Don Bradley as probably, if you could just sit, and you have sat down and talked with him. I think he knows more about the actual historical proof and the real documents and all of that than anyone living.
Okay, so there isn't another sort of polygamy apologist theologian that's writing right now in the kind of in the vein of Orson Pratt and Ogden Kraut. You look to Ogden Kraut's works as the.
I do like Ogden Kraut. D. Michael Quinn was also really cool. I'm really sad that we lost him. He's died. And I'm really sad that he died before he published some of the stuff he was working on. And I'm hoping that some of the other people who know him, some of these other scholars, can actually get some of the stuff published. Because one of the things, for example, that D. Michael Quinn was working on, and I talked to him about personally before he died, was he wrote, it was a bombshell for the church, was Post-manifesto Polygamy, 1890 to 1904. Well, that was a bombshell in the world because people were saying, wait a second, there was Post-manifesto Polygamy? I thought that it just instantly, I know exactly. I know your story, right? And there's post-second manifesto polygamy, because
that's my story.
Polygamy did not end until the third manifesto. The third manifesto of 1933, I think it is. That's when polygamy stopped.
Okay.
No, 23 was a lot of interesting stuff, but the third manifesto was 1933, and they denied the existence of the 1886 revelation. They denied the existence of all the post-manifesto plural marriages. That's when they actually started excommunicating, say, a woman who enters a plural marriage. She would actually be excommunicated. You could really lose your membership. That didn't really happen until the 1930s. Before that, you could just be a member of the church in good standing and be a polygamist just fine. So long as you weren't too vocal or too public, and then they would do a public excommunication for you if you're a general authority, or John Woolley, for example, who's big name in Mormon fundamentalism. He was performing plural marriages in the Salt Lake Temple for decades, and they were like, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "I'm just doing what I was told," but they had to make a public case for him because it was all over the Salt Lake Tribune that the temple ceilings are going on in the Salt Lake Temple every day that are plural marriages, and they're like, how is this allowed? And Francis Lyman especially wanted to make sure that the church didn't get in a lot of trouble because it could have gotten in a lot of trouble if.
So that's okay.
No.
That's interesting. My understanding is different of the post-manifesto polygamy is that it actually was really quite few and far between, and mostly in Mexico and Canada.
Secretive,
I didn't think like it wasn't generally happening in the Salt Lake Temple unless it was just one rogue sealer doing it, but it wasn't with the it was
not with the approval of the church as an institution, for sure. Now, honestly, it wasn't really with the direct approval of the church. For a long time before that, so this is one of the things D. Michael Quinn actually said to me. He said, you can't understand Joseph F. Smith if you don't understand that he was animated by two fundamental principles, neither of which he was willing to compromise at all at any time. One, he was going to do anything in his power to keep plural marriage and the practice of plural marriage alive. And two, he was going to do anything he could to defend the church no matter what, including lie, including change policies, including excommunicate polygamists, anything. And so he was privately telling people, you should go get plurally married and go talk to so-and-so and stuff like that to make it happen. And he
sent my great-grandfather to Mexico. That was in 1906.
And at the same time, he was publicly saying, there's no plural marriage in this church. It is not allowed. I will excommunicate you if you do this.
So how do you think about that when we know that Joseph's own scripture says the liar shall be thrust down to hell and lying is, how does that, this whole lying for the kingdom, lying for the Lord, whatever term we want to use. How do you think about that?
I think it's a very, very good and moral thing to do, to lie whenever you're lying to protect people from violence. There's a very big difference between lying because you want to deceive someone or harm because you want to create harm, because you want to create fraud. It's a very, very different thing when you are lying to protect the innocent from the violent. And that's exactly what I believe Joseph F. Smith was doing. There were some very, very violent men, not only putting people in cages, but raping and murdering. And he was doing whatever he could to protect the innocent while at the same time trying to live his faith. And I think that is a very appropriate thing to do, a righteous thing to do.
Okay. So you are for lying when it feels necessary. Because I don't think that Joseph F. Smith,
and it's specifically for these types of purposes. If the Nazis come to your house and say, "Are there Jews in your attic?" You say no.
I don't think that's a good comparison though, because
because this is literally the government with men with guns coming to imprison and murder people under the auspice of the law. How is that any different than a Nazi? That is literally exactly what was happening to our people for decades.
We didn't have concentration camps where we were killing people by the in Mormonism. In Utah.
Okay, so what you're saying is the difference is that maybe there's a matter of scale. The fact that not very many people died in prison means that it wasn't a concentration camp. So it wasn't necessarily that their goal was genocide through murder. Their goal was genocide by taking away our families. It's still
I think
they were trying to wipe out our people.
I think the goal was to protect women and children because there were also, we can move on from this because I don't want to get caught up in too many disagreements. Sure. And I think they're worth having, but our whole time could be gone on.
But you're saying that you don't necessarily view these marshals as villains when they were, they chased women and children through the snow. They shot people.
Well, yeah, maybe it'd be good to talk about. I'm talking about, for example, the anti-polygamy standard and the women in Utah who got involved, Jenny Anderson Froiseth and the other non-Mormon Utah women who saw a lot of the suffering, because it's easy to only see the what's the word I'm looking for? The atrocities on one side or the offenses on one side, right? There were like
Sure.
Carrie Owens showed up on one of these women's porch after the horrors that she had experienced, right? And there was blood atonement happening, and there was all kinds of things on the LDS side. And so I don't necessarily see it as I see it as Joseph F. Smith believed that polygamy had to, like, the fundamentalist doctrine that was explained to me by my AUB friends, which made perfect sense to me in the mindset I was in, was that all things had been restored for the last time to never be taken from the earth. Polygamy was part of that. Joseph F. Smith knew it had to stay on the earth, so he asked people to be separate from the church for a time to preserve this doctrine, and one day they would come back together. I think Joseph F. Smith was being very, like, he felt like polygamy has to remain on the earth. The church is we're going to lose our properties. We're going to lose our, we're going to have a harder time as a church. So I'm going to do whatever I need to do to keep polygamy and to keep the church as a whole. But I don't see it as that they were being threatened with violences.
Well, it's sort of naive. He thought that the church and the polygamists would all just get back together. There are still people, primarily in AUB, that I've heard teach this, that still believe the mainstream LDS church and the polygamists are all just going to reconcile. It's all going to be fine.
I think that's the AUB doctrine. Yeah.
And so I've heard plenty of the members there say that, and I think that's naive. I mean, that's not how it happened with Joseph Smith. The Pope didn't say, a new prophet is here, let's make him the head of the Catholic Church. I don't think that once you split off and start doing your own things, that you're going to just miraculously all come back together.
Okay, but I know you can't speak for every fundamentalist, but I would ask, in general, would you say that for fundamentalists, lying to protect polygamy is completely moral, is like totally fine to do?
Absolutely. Okay, and again, I think lying is the wrong word for this. Protecting your children is appropriate by most means necessary, almost any means necessary. These are our families, and they're being targeted by violent people. Of course, you don't want to just go out there and just put everybody right in front of these persecutions. You don't just want to throw everyone to the wolves, right?
I think so.
Absolutely appropriate. I mean, look at Joseph Smith. Of course, you don't believe he was a martyr to the principle of polygamy, as I do, but they literally did kill him. If he was lying, and so when I believe Joseph Smith was not telling everybody the whole story, it's like, even the partial story that he did tell got him killed. This is not some imaginary threat. This is not some, it's no big deal, he can tell everyone everything. They killed him. They literally did kill him for what he preached. Same with Jesus Christ. He didn't tell everyone everything. He told a lot of parables, because if he told everybody everything, they might have killed him even sooner. And you can't tell me that if he didn't lie to them, or if he didn't tell them parables rather than telling them the whole transparent truth, that they wouldn't have killed him. They did kill him.
So was Jesus killed because he was a polygamist?
I believe that was certainly part of it.
Okay. And so let's remove Jesus and Joseph.
Not the whole end-all be-all of the whole gospel. I think we both agree on that. I think this is one small principle. Even though I'm in a church that is famous for being polygamous, polygamy isn't like the central tenet of the gospel. Polygamy is this little detail that's way off.
The highest, holiest principle. You just had said that. Like that.
Well, I did say it is a high and holy principle, but it's because it's part of a much higher and holier principle. It's one incidental to the law of having a covenant relationship. One of the ways.
And yet it was what got Joseph killed. Joseph was a martyr for the sake of polygamy.
I do believe so, yes. But he was also a martyr for the sake of Jesus, because he was a martyr for the covenants that we make with God, our relationship to God. And these doctrines are something that the devil cannot have, because on the earth, if he can help it, because the devil's fine with us being religious. He just does not want us to enter into that covenant relationship with God, whereby we enter his actual presence. Because so long as he can keep us out, if we can just be like, I've got the philosophies of men mingled with scripture, I'm just fine. I just want someone to preach to me, so to speak. So long as we're at that level, the devil's fine. He's happy. What he doesn't want us to do is enter that covenant. And that covenant ends up being somewhat polygamous in nature, for example, because I believe he can make that covenant with you. He can also make that covenant with me. It's not monogamous in the sense that he can only make that covenant with one person. He can make that covenant with each of us so that we enter into his presence. And
it's also not sexual.
Polygamy becomes one of the ways
I understand. Sexual.
What's that?
Like to make the covenant with each of us, it's not a sexual covenant, because then if he covenanted with men, then homosexuality is the highest, holiest principle of the gospel. And if he covenanted, right? So I think there's a flaw.
Right. So there's always this, people always get really, really uptight when it comes to sex, you know? And when it
right.
comes,
Well, I think that comparing the covenant that God makes to each of us individually to polygamy or to marriage, like as I had already said, Jesus's symbol of the bridegroom and the bride applies to Christ and the church, not to Christ and each individual person. But
right, more as an institution, as a corporation, as a concept, as
no, as the people who are Christ's church, which is the name of your church, but the people who are one because they all have given their hearts to Jesus Christ, been born again, come unto Christ, and are unified in the name of Christ. That's the Church of Jesus Christ. I could look up.
We should all be one in the sense that, I mean, that's the whole point of consecration. We live the law of consecration in my church too. We don't get as much heat for that. People are much more worried about polygamy, mostly because of sex. But we should all be one. Our whole family should be one.
Well, when Jesus says, if ye are not one, ye are not mine.
Right. And that we all may be one.
Church, that's a very monogamous language, right? That's very much,
that's the most polygamous thing I've ever heard.
Okay. All right. So
we're all going to be one with Jesus as Jesus is one with the Father. Oh my gosh, that's so polygamous. We're all going to be one, not just one.
Not saying,
all one.
When he says, if you are not one, you are not mine, he's not saying, and you are an individual, one with me, and you, which he's saying, if you're not all one with each other, because I have one bride. I have one bride, that's the church.
Well, and this goes back to something that you said at the wedding that I thought was interesting. This is a family affair. The big question that is the difference between you and me, but I do think one thing we agree on is this is a family affair. Why does God care about us at all? Why is God even involved? Why did God send Jesus Christ? Why do we even have a church? Because it's a family thing. We're the children of God. God wants us all to be one family. He wants us back to live with him as a family. The difference is that we view it differently as to what a family looks like. What is a family, right? And I've got this broad concept of Mormon polygamous clans being connected through the law of adoption and all these different kingdoms, and that's how it all connects to God. And I'm not exactly sure what your model is, but I'm sure it includes monogamy at some point. And then, but we do agree it's a family affair, right?
I would have to understand what you mean by that a little better, but I do think that the purpose of this is to bring to pass the immortality and eternal life of man. I think that our covenants with one another teach us how to be in covenant with God and with, love God, love your fellow man. That's what the gospel is about. Right. And then like giving our hearts and our lives, laying everything, becoming one with Jesus Christ, receiving his image in our countenance. To me, that's what we're aiming for. But let me ask you this question, because you did talk about how, what was your wording? I can't remember, but basically they killed Joseph because of polygamy. So, they want to kill the polygamist. And so let me ask you this, because
they killed Joseph for the gospel. And I believe polygamy is incidentally part of the practice of people who follow Christ, who I believe is polygamy.
Okay. So if we remove definitely Jesus, because I don't think that we would have universal consensus that Jesus was a polygamist.
A lot of people think he was like a celibate. Sure. No marriage at all.
And then if we remove Joseph Smith as well, since there's controversy between us, so then we can look to the known polygamists where there's no controversy, which is Brigham Young, John Taylor. Right. So my question is, it's interesting, like, was Brigham hunted and killed because of polygamy? Was like you keep saying there's all this violence aimed at polygamists. I guess the most recent example we can look at is Warren Jeffs. And for me, the concern about Warren Jeffs isn't the violence against him. He was persecuting. Yeah, that's what I mean. It was the violence that he was exerting on others. And that's the challenge that I have come up with as I have looked into polygamy, because Brigham Young, there was some stuff going on.
Let me point out some stuff here, okay? So Brigham Young, yes, I agree. I'm not going to get everyone to love Brigham Young. It was the Wild West, literally. And he was the leader and even a governor and all kinds of things like that at the time. There was a lot of weird stuff that happened, okay? I'm not going to say
it wasn't really the Wild West. It was his community. He had complete control. The Wild West was because no one had authority, right? He reigned it he controlled it and made it the way he wanted it to be. But okay.
He certainly tried, but
The violence wasn't happening because Brigham didn't have enough control. Should we say that? It wasn't the Wild West. It was Brigham's kingdom. But okay.
There was a lot of violence, I think, that he had nothing to do with. But
sure,
I'm not saying we're going to make you like him. But when you ask, is there danger? This cannot be proven, but there's a lot of evidence that shows that Brigham Young was murdered. He was poisoned. He had all of
by his own household, not by anti-polygamists, by one of his wives, the people who proposed that.
A lot of people believe it was one of his wives, who I believe was an anti-polygamist. That's why she did it. She was unhappy with the polygamy situation, and she became the agent for other people who wanted to get rid of him, including, I believe, people in government. John Taylor comes next. John Taylor died of exposure and pneumonia on the run from the marshals. And he was shot in Kirkland, in Carthage. So here's the thing that, I know that people want to make John Taylor, the vegetarian pacifist, a murderer. But John Taylor, I believe, was shot with Joseph. His blood was mingled with the martyrs once, and then he was martyred a second time by the marshals in Utah. So yes, I believe he was absolutely a martyr. I believe he was the twice martyred prophet.
Okay. I want to just clarify, there is a difference between being on the run as a fugitive because you are breaking the law and
being run on the fugitive because they hate your religion and want to destroy your people.
Oh, okay. Well, and we're always in danger to put motives.
Fugitive makes it sound like he's committed some crime.
Well, let me ask you this, because so the twin relics of barbarism was the Republican rallying cry, right? Yeah. Polygamy and slavery. So the people who were the slaveholders could say they just hate our culture, they hate our society, they're the enemies, they're inflicting violence upon us, without acknowledging why it was being opposed and why they were prosecuting a war, right?
Right. And I guess you're saying that you thought that they were prosecuting this war against the saints because they had good reason to. And I'm saying I think it was a genocidal impulse.
Okay, so that's a difference in motive, because we can look at what happened after polygamy was like we can look at the women who were living in Utah and how they were trying to help. If you've read through the anti-polygamy standard, I really recommend that to people, especially the originals that were printed in the newspaper.
Well, I've also read the Women of Utah and Assembly and a bunch of other pro-polygamy things done entirely by women leadership in Utah. They even had a vote on whether or not they wanted to have plural marriage in Utah, and it came in favor of plural marriage overwhelmingly. And some people say, oh, well, these dumb women were probably forced into it or deluded or something. And I'm like, no, these were like the forefront of the women's rights movement at the time. And they chose what they wanted for their own religion.
It's very useful to read that in the context of also reading the Journal of Discourses and the Complete Teachings of Brigham Young and others to see what the teaching was, because polygamous women in the FLDS, right, that I think you would probably not, they would also vote to support what was happening. And they would also all lie and say, there are no underage brides, there's no rape happening, and these are all our children, and all of that was lies. That was all lies. Right? They like the society was victimized.
FLDS
I'm not trying to.
Yeah, the FLDS is a very repressive, become a very repressive cult, and that's one of the reasons why they've shrunk so much. They had like almost 10,000 members before Warren Jeffs took charge, and there's like 1,000 believers left or something, or a few hundred. It's like they've been devastated.
I agree, but the point I'm trying to make is, I think it's dangerous to or when I say dangerous, like not accurate to say it was a genocidal impulse to come after polygamy any more than it was a genocidal impulse to go after slavery. I think we should look more fairly at what their reasons.
But you said I have to leave Jesus aside as a martyr. I have to leave Joseph Smith aside as a martyr.
No,
I believe Brigham Young was a martyr.
Not as martyrs, as polygamists.
As a martyr for the cause of polygamy. Okay. Yes. But I believe Brigham Young was a martyr for polygamy. I believe John Taylor is a martyr for polygamy. Wilford Woodruff, actually, this is another one of them that you can't prove, I can't prove, but is interesting. He went out to the Bohemian Grove and never came back. He died out there. I think he was martyred. Okay, so now I'm not saying that I believe.
Why did he go there?
One president of the church was a martyr for polygamy. I believe the first 4 presidents of the church were all martyred for polygamy. And then you've got my own more recent history. Rulon Allred was a martyr for polygamy, and he was murdered in Salt Lake.
But who was he killed by? Other polygamists. See, I think polygamy breeds violence, but in the opposite direction that you do, because polygamy leads to blood. Like, I think polygamy breeds violence, but it's the polygamists often, and I'm not saying all polygamists. I don't think you're going to, although as soon as I realized how many polygamists were at the wedding, I did get a little bit nervous because
you thought
I don't
we
know
would
how
do
many
something violent?
No, I don't know how many polygamists still believe in blood atonement, because
I danced with two women at the same time on the dance floor at the wedding.
The LeBarons followed their nose in these doctrines that Brigham taught through polygamy to blood atonement, which is what they started to carry out. So there is a danger there. So let me
and it does depend on how you look at it, where it comes from. You could let the buck stop only at the trigger person, the person who did the shooting. Chenoweth, Marianne Chenoweth, I want to say, was the one who shot Rulon Allred. But most people will say, no, she's not acting alone, obviously. It's her husband, Orville LeBaron, that she's following. And most people say, Orville LeBaron isn't acting alone. He got the idea from blood atonement, like you were saying. Well, here's the thing, too. Oh, no, it's Rena. I think it's Rena Chenoweth. Anyway, Rena Chenoweth, who was the one who shot Rulon Allred, actually was acquitted by an all-LDS jury of the murder after they deliberated for, I think it was 12 minutes in the jury room. And to say that wasn't arranged would be shocking to my sensibilities. And then she immediately went out and she's written a book about the murder and why she did it. And in there, she said that the mainstream LDS church paid her $400,000 to do it, and that Orville wanted the money. So do I think that it was the polygamist that shot Rulon? Not really. It was the polygamist wife of a polygamist who shot him. But if you want to follow the money, I think it was the mainstream LDS church leadership.
So why?
It was the monogamist that shot Rulon Allred.
Why was there such a long list of people to be killed, and why has it continued on so long? Is the LDS church paying to have all of those people killed?
No. They simply found people willing to commit murder who committed some murders for profit, some murders for personal vendettas, some murders for a lot of other things, and used them as the hatchet. They used them as the blunt instrument to do their will because they knew that they could pay them off, and they knew that they'd be willing to do it. But I don't actually think that ends with blood atonement. I think the reason they killed Rulon Allred was because he was vocal and he was public and he was political and he was fighting for his family. And they had to get rid of an example like that in the heart of Salt Lake City. So there's some on one hand and some on another, but I don't think that history's messy as heck. And I don't think that you can just say that one side is always the bad guys. And I don't think that's always true of the LDS church either. The Orville LeBaron was a psycho, but that doesn't make him not a useful psycho sometimes.
Right. I think that's part of what is concerning to me, is that there are psychos in the world, and the doctrines that Brigham espoused and taught are dangerous in the hands of psychos, right?
Well, and I think that's true. That can be true of twisting anything. I mean, especially political ideologies, but religion also. All religions can do that.
Okay, so I have so many directions I want to go. Let me ask you this, and then it was interesting because there are so many places. Let me go here first. When we met at the wedding, the question you wanted to ask me, I believe, was like, are polygamy deniers sincere? Like, there's no way you can sincerely believe what you believe.
Do you actually believe that Joseph wasn't a polygamist? Like, the history is different than what every historian has said? Or do you just have such a strong ideological dogma agenda that you're willing to deny the facts? Or do you really believe that those are different facts, alternative facts?
That question I see exactly in reverse. I think that, for example, Brian Hales has such a desperate need that I catch him in lie after lie after lie. And I absolutely have come to this through, I'm going to start revealing more things that are just not true. And so the more I looked into the evidence, the more convinced I have become through pure, solid evidence. So I'm completely sincere. But I don't think you knew that I have 13 children and that I I
knew from an episode, but yeah.
Okay, but when we met at the wedding, I don't think you had known that. I think you were really surprised to know that I'm kind of not in every way Satan as it
was beginning to sound, and the other thing too that I didn't really get into that I want to ask now about, and you can answer this when you talk about why you sincerely come to these conclusions is my other really big question was, did Denver Snuffer or Phil Davis or someone else or both put you up to this? Because I was concerned that the whole polygamy denial was specifically to give Phil Davis or Denver Snuffer or one of these other cultists power in a movement that I believe is strongly supported. And I believe that Denver Snuffer, that's a dark man. He's not a nice guy. I've met him on multiple occasions. I don't believe he's genuine. I believe he's selfish and dangerous. And Phil Davis, I've met him on many occasions. He is dangerous. He is vicious. That man has some serious darkness in him. And my concern is that I see the Joseph Smith Never Lived Polygamy whole movement as essentially being propped up by these cultists. And I thought, okay, so what's your connection to all of this? Because that was my accusation and my real concern.
Okay, we had to break this conversation in half. And I know some of you are just going to be on the edge of your seats and angry that I'm leaving you with a cliffhanger. So I have to apologize for that. But at the same time, I thought it was just a delightful place to end. And hopefully you'll be excited to come back next week to find out if I have indeed been put up to this by Denver Snuffer or, I can't remember the other guy's name, the Doctrine of Christ guy, Phil Davis, right? If one of them put me up to this. But I do so appreciate, again, I appreciate Benjamin Shaffer coming and asking these questions so we can really get to know each other better and understand that we're both just well-meaning people trying our best to do what's right and who disagree along the way. I really believe that that's what this is all about. So huge shout out to Benjamin. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. And I'll see you next week for the rest of the conversation.